Emu is actually a force for good, trying to prevent the Great War. In Emu's mind, war is the worst, so they would do anything to prevent it. However, Emu is most pure of heart, Uno reverse with her powers. Emu will be on Luffy's side to fight Blackbeard. So mate, that is quite the prediction. And I do think that this would be a pretty tough ask. However, this chapter does have one little secret that has been hidden from us English-speaking swine, which is that St. Summers and St. Gillingham refer to Emu with a very special title known as Ontai, which I'd never even heard of before this chapter came out, but it gets used in relation to someone so mighty and distant that you can't help but feel respect for, but also someone close enough that there's an affection as well, which sounds quite religious to me. Like the love that you would have for your god combined with that respect, admiration, and of course distance, because you're you and the god is God. But it was used historically for particularly impactful figures like Nobunaga Oda. And I should say that Viz has chosen to translate this as Great One, which from what I've been told doesn't quite nail the nuance of it. It's not their fault, we just don't really have a title that does. But it's a surprisingly warm title used with a sense of familiarity. And I suppose the implication is that Summers and Gillingham do have that warmth towards Emu, and it's not just a cold, subservient relationship, which definitely adds a new layer to Emu and the whole operation that I've never previously considered. But this idea also goes back to the reason why it was said that 20 kingdoms formed an alliance in the first place. It was because they were concerned about that one ancient kingdom, all of their technologies, and particularly after it went and invented 3 ancient weapons. And perhaps like many of Vegapunk's creations, these were never intended to be weapons, but you can't blame the rest of the world for looking at them and going, nah mate, I should probably do something about that. And to Emu's credit, as far as we know, he has kept the world in a state of mostly peace for the last 800 years. I use the word mostly there very generously. It would be more accurate to say that he's kept the world government affiliated nations in a state of peace, whilst every other nation has been subject to a wide array of ever-expanding and disturbingly creative atrocities. And right there lies my main issue with Emu being this sort of misunderstood force of good. One Piece does have quite the habit of rehabilitating former antagonists, to the point where it's actually significantly rarer for an antagonist to remain a bad dude, such as the case of Rob Lucci, who did indeed do that. But with every villain who undergoes the shift from bad to not as bad, there has to be some plausibility to it. Such as recently with Ulti in page 1. They can kind of get away with being good guys now because they were just kids with tragic backstories who were indoctrinated into the cult of Kaido. And very importantly, we never saw either of them do anything particularly evil or unforgivable. The worst thing that happened was that Ulti smacked Tama, which was bad, but I don't know. It is implied that as members of the Toby Roppo, they did worse things off screen, but we never saw any of it, so it doesn't really matter because it's not in our minds as readers. However, with Emu, what we saw very much on screen was him ordering the deaths of every living being on the Lucia, and unless what he did was magically transport everyone to a pocket dimension to live happily ever after with infinite food and puppies, that is going to be a pretty tough act to come back from. However, Emu could very much see himself as the hero here, the good guy doing everything he can to prevent the prophesized Great War from literally ending the world. Because according to the Harley text, we are moving on to the next one soon. And Emu really could be the flip side of the sun god Nika, the destroyer to Luffy's liberator, or even a previous Nika carnation who was responsible for enacting the destruction of the previous world. But another thing I have difficulty with is the sheer cruelty that has taken place under Emu's rule. And we have countless, but we only need one example, which is Saint Saturn's experimentation on Ginny. But that stuff happens on the Holy Land day after day after day, and it is so hard to see someone who propagates the world noble system considering themselves in any way good. But even then, putting that to one side, there are a lot of factions here, and it's not out of the question for Blackbeard to become a problem so massive that the world government and the Straw Hats do end up being temporarily allies to take him down, because that is exactly what happened with Rocksteady Zebek on God Valley. But it could also work out to be another scenario where Luffy and Blackbeard end up reluctantly working together, like during the Impel Down incident, or there is indeed the worst case scenario, which I've speculated on before, which is that Blackbeard offers an alliance with the world government, and we have an impossibly uphill battle to fight. What if the ability to turn into demons is similar to the drugs Hody had in Gishman Island? So the drugs are quite similar in many ways. And what we're talking about are the energy steroids that Hody just guzzled from the tomato box. These funky little pills were so old that no one really knows where they came from, who made them, or any of the other question words. And when the new fisherman pirates took them, their muscle mass increased, making them bigger. And in the case of Hody, who OD'd on them, it changed his appearance completely. It even gave him some rather demonic spikes on his wrists. But the pills, this is important, they also had healing properties. After Hody got sliced up by Zoro, he was in pain, so much pains, and so he took far too many energy steroids in order to heal himself. So there is an argument here that the regeneration effect is present in these pills on an incredibly small scale. And very importantly, the energy steroids also distorted the minds of the new fisherman pirates. After taking the pills, they became noticeably more aggressive and, dare I say, demonic, just like the giants have become here after being domi-reversied. And also, the energy steroids come at the cost of lifespan, and after heavily abusing them, all of the new fisherman pirates ended up as shriveled old men. So I think there is a very strong case to be made that these energy steroids are potentially linked to Imu, because these pills probably date back to the Void Century at the very least, and I can imagine them being a gift from Imu, a sinister gift, with some of his powers imbued into them, with the intention of turning Fishman Island against itself. But luckily, the pills were never taken, or if they were, it was quickly discovered and the rest was sealed away in this box. And they were labeled the national treasure of Fishman Island to make sure that this evil never touched anyone else. And just as a side note on this topic, in One Piece Party, one of the many spin-off manga series, these do also exist in the form of the energy steroid dango. And what they do is inflate their consumers into big old balloons, kind of like Gecko Moria after eating one too many shadows, which I love. One Piece Party is so good, and I really wish there was an official translation. Could Gunko be special because someone did the immortality surgery? Law's fruit? That would be the perfect vessel for Imu, as it just can't die. I mean, we're still very early days with this whole vessel stuff, but also this discussion gets a bit dangerous because we're now risking conflating misconceptions. Law's devil fruit is said to be able to grant perpetual youth, which is not immortality. The person granted this youth can still die. It's kind of like the opposite of what we're seeing with the Holy Knights right now, where they can't be permanently harmed, but apparently they do still grow old. But the perpetual youth recipient, in theory, can be harmed, but will not grow old, although in the case of Gunko, cannot be harmed because there's also a mix of Imu regeneration narrationing powers. Now, with that said, we have been patiently, ever so patiently, waiting for the payoff of Law's devil fruit, which was set up all of the way back in Dressrosa, as we do know that there was a previous user of this fruit who became something of a historical legend. In Law's flashback, father of Diaz Break, Diaz Barrel, said the following about the Ope Ope no Mi. According to history, someone once ate this fruit and cured so many diseases with miracle operations. That doctor went on to be known as a legend, and you can tell quite a bit by the use of the word history as opposed to, say, legend or myth. This is history. This is an accepted fact, which, even the One Piece itself isn't an accepted fact around the world. It's only recently in the history of the series did we even confirm that it existed. It took the diary of Kozuki Oden to do so. And I really, really want to emphasize that the person saying this was Diaz Barrels. So this history occurred recently enough for even a dropkick like Barrels to have known of him. And it's also suspected that this previous user performed the perpetual youth surgery, and that is what made him a legend. The fact that he was such a prolific doctor that he gave a patient eternal youth, and that's why the value of the Ope Ope no Mi skyrocketed to 5 billion berries. Because this eternal youth business wasn't just an old myth about fictional fruit. We saw it happen in the history. And to bring this all the way back around to Gunko, we do know from her flashback with Brook that this girl's probably in her 60s at the very least, potentially 70s. And maybe there is a pretty fun payoff to be had with the legendary historical Ope Ope no Mi user having been forced to give Gunko perpetual youth so that she can be used as a vessel by Imu. But also, Imu does have enough crazy powers going on at the moment that it could be any number of other options as well. I find it hilarious that Imu is literally the edgy fan art of what certain people in the fandom drew up for Gear 5 originally before it was released. It is a bit like that. If you're relatively new to One Piece, or specifically One Piece fan culture online, then you may or may not have been around for this. But ever since Gear 4th happened on Dressrosa, there was a good 7 years of intense speculation of what Gear 5th was going to look like. And for quite frankly, an embarrassing amount of years, the design that became became most prominent was this very aggressive Haki-clad Luffy. And look, in mild defense of this was because Gear 4th did portray Luffy as a much more serious figure than his base form. So one conclusion to be drawn from that would be that Gear 5th would be a lot more serious, like peak serious, which is an idea that I despised to my very core, and when Gear 5th finally did show itself, the sheer joy of this form gave us the meme of the virgin Gear 5th edgelord versus the Chad Nika god. And I really do love that with Imu right now, we are seeing the edgelord form manifest as the direct opposite of Luffy. These very dark, sinister, and above all violent beings, which isn't just represented in Imu, but also the Domi reverse he targets. And it's getting to the point where I really want to see Luffy back in the actual main meat of the story, because I would love to see how the drums of liberation interact with these demons. On Egghead Island, when the drums were particularly active, Dory, Broggy, their flagship, and even the water around them were all dancing uncontrollably. They were subject to such intense liberation that the immense danger behind them was all but forgotten. So the drums might be the key to flipping people back, because what's stronger, Imu's corruption and his constrainment, or Luffy's freedom and his general being a good dude? Why using he for Imu? So I'm using he because I'm assuming that if Imu has spent the last 800 years wanking off to that portrait of Lily, then he's probably male. I do understand that Imu's gender has always been deliberately ambiguous, but let's be realistic about fictional pirates for a second. If there is some sort of love story being written in a shonen manga, even a one-sided stalkery love story, then chances are it's going to be between a man and a woman. Granted, right now, Imu is possessing a female body with Gunko, and I have seen some people believe that Imu's voice in the anime is female. I'm not entirely sold on that myself. I think the voice is distorted to the point where it's deliberately not giving a single thing away, and it becomes a bit of an auditory Rorschach test. You hear what you want to hear. So if you want to hear a woman, you hear a woman, and if you want to hear a man, you hear a man. Also, if you want to hear a child, you hear a child, which could also be a woman voice. And as far as the Japanese-speaking community goes, they seem fairly convinced that Imu's dialogue is very male. So until proven otherwise, I'm just going to go with Occam's razor on this one. But also, it's deliberately ambiguous at this stage, so it doesn't really matter what you use. This made me think of the possibility of the Five Elders being originally part of Joy Boy's crew, and then became Imu's underlings by her magic. So that would be the saddest possible outcome. To hop into a Void Century flashback and to watch Joy Boy recruit each of the Five Elders. J. Garcia Satin, join my crew. I do think that probably would be a bit too much even for One Piece. Sometimes bad people can maybe just be bad people. But I could also see each of the Five Elders being former kings that Joy Boy was maybe on good terms with, like how Luffy has his collection of kings that love him. I actually find it more likely that Imu may have used his powers on some that we already know were Joy Boy's comrades, such as Emmett. After waking up, Mr. Emmett apologized to Joy Boy in chapter 1111, and perhaps that was because despite his best intentions, Emmett was flipped in the original final war and ended up being forced to betray Joy Boy. And perhaps Joy Boy could have been on the verge of defeating Imu, like how Odin was about to kill Kaido, but evil plottings occurred that sealed both of their fates. And also one idea I did want to mention, this isn't mine, and I forget who put this in my comments, my apologies for that, but it was posed that Zunesha could also have been a victim of Imu's spellcasting, as in Zunesha wasn't originally an elephant. However, as part of his punishment, Imu turned Zunesha into an elephant and sentenced him to walk the seas for all eternity. And that might go some way towards explaining why Zunesha has one of those incredibly rare Emu-style eyes, albeit a different color to Emu and Mihawk, at least in the manga. What if instead of King Harold being reversied, it was Loki that was instead, and Harold sacrificed himself to turn Loki back after Loki injured Jarl? So that would be a very One Piece thing to do. For a father to tragically sacrifice himself for the sake of his son. Maybe Loki got a bit too full of himself and wanted to pursue the peak of battle power that is currently intoxicating Dory and Broggy, but ended up committing a couple of regretful actions that Harold had to pay the price for. I'm wondering if the book was created by a former awakened book fruit user. We saw the book fruit user could trap people in stories. So I don't think that the previous user of this fruit would have even needed to have been awakened to make this idea work. The book fruit is held by Charlotte Monteur in the modern day, and it's one of those abilities that was criminally underused, or at least undershown because it had so much insane potential. It could transport people into the world of books and trap targets in a story of Monteur's choosing, although these book worlds were purely illusory. However, he could also trap people literally within books, which he did to Luffy and Nami, but also for Big Mom's collection of rare living creatures. And he also used them to hook up an extensive network of Dendenmushis to communicate all throughout Totoland. But TLDR, if Imu's book was created by a previous user of this fruit, then each page could simply be used to store something or someone. In the case of chapter 1150, it would have stored the items needed to invoke Domi Reversi. Because Big Mom didn't need Mont d'Or to access the books in her library, so in theory, all we need is for a previous fruit user to have created the book for Imu to use. And then what we need is for the powers to remain after the death of that fruit user, which, if it's true for Boa Hancock's Devil Fruit, then why not Miscellaneous Book Dude as well? Has everyone forgotten about the Luiano message at the beginning of Elbaf? Will that ever be answered? So I am starting to have horrible feelings that this might become one of those classic One Piece non-mysteries, like the Egghead Silhouette or Marco's Letter. We give Oda a lot of credit for foreshadowing and mystery planting, but sometimes things do lack resolution, especially in the modern arcs. And so if this doesn't turn out to be some cryptic warning about time dilation or whatever else could have a massive impact, then this is a sort of thing that will probably be answered in an SBS segment, like the answer to who gave Luffy the food during Egghead Island. What if the God of Earth and God of Sea are not Devil Fruit users like Luffy, but a reference to Zoro and Jinbei? Kind of like how Usopp became a god, so too will Zoro and Jinbei. You know, it's very interesting that you do bring that up, because we have our four named gods, Sun, Earth, Forest, and Sea, and that fits almost perfectly into our monster quartet. After the reveal of Zoro's family tree in an SBS segment, it was very quickly pounced upon that Zoro's mother's name is Terra, meaning Earth, while Sanji's mother's name was Sora, which in Japanese means sky. And between them, you've got the sky and the earth on Luffy's side, but when you add Jinbei into that mix, he's also got the sea fighting for him. It fits almost perfectly. Luffy is the sun god, Jinbei is the sea god, Zoro is the earth god. The only one that doesn't quite get us there is Sanji, because he's all about the sky, and our leftover god is the forest god. But regardless, there is a strong environmental theme that Oda has been working towards with our crew, and even with Nami being about weather in general. And not just that, but you've also got very distinct areas of humanity. You've got Robin representing history, Frankie with engineering, Chopper is medicine, Brook is the arts, Usopp is, he's whatever's left over, a god of that. And in the end, our whole crew seems to be designed to represent the sum total of humanity, eventually coming together in order to defeat the darkness that plagues us.